everyone, welcome to UMLO Extras. And today we're going to talk about starting a choreography diagram with simulation using scenarios. Step one before you get into the exercise is to baseline your package here. So Control Alt and B to bring up baseline. And we're going to create a new baseline 01. And we're just going to call this start choreography. All right. So that's step one. So now we have a baseline we can always revert back to if we need to during this exercise. Step two is to start a scenario. You could pick any element in here to start. We're going to start with a start. So we're going to double click to open this up, and we're going to go down to scenarios, and we're going to select structured editor. Then what we're going to do is we're going to grab the scenario tab, hold down the left mouse button, and drag and drop it just to the right of our diagram area. And you can see that we have a blank scenario structured editor to start building on. Step three is to name your scenario. Give it a unique name. By default, it's basic path. We're just going to call this order processing start event. You can call it anything you want. I would call it something that's going to be unique to the other elements within your project or this diagram, especially this diagram, and we'll see that in a short time. Step four is to go to the context references and start building some context around this scenario. Now, because there is a sequence flow to order request activity, its connection is a control flow, is already populated in the context reference, but we need to add some other context reference. So we can right click in here, add context reference, and then you can go to, let's say this is where our enterprise continuum is, and we want to bring in some context around Kafka bus. So we'll select it, and Kafka bus architecture, this is node architecture within the application architecture design, is added in the context for this particular scenario. After you've added some context to your context references, we're going to go back to entry points here, and we're going to get started on step 5, and that's start building the steps within your scenario. You can always come back and add more context. You can add in constraints. You can add in, manage your endpoints, all of that from down here, but we want to get into actually start building the steps to help validate our context and the sequence of events within this scenario. When starting, use human active voice just to state out what you want. And if you need to be on your context reference so you can reference these nouns down below, go ahead and do so. So we might do something like receive, if we misspell something, we can always come back, right? Receive, order, request, object, all right? You can see as I'm typing, it's underlined. That means it is connected to the context reference that's down here. So where do we want to receive it from? We want to receive it from Kafka bus, and then that's all you need to do, right? And it's not a stick figure. It's we'll double click and change that to a system. Don't worry about that. That's not a big deal. You can always come back and change that. You can always right click in here, and you can switch step to user, or you can switch step to system, all right? So you're just going to go down through here and put in the steps. Don't worry about uses, results, or state yet, all right? Just go down and list the actions as you would think they would flow. And if you miss anything, no problem. You can always insert or remove steps. Now that we've done our first path, let's go ahead and generate an activity diagram. Just a simple activity diagram. We're going to go ahead and select it, and it's going to go through the steps that we have, the nouns and verbs in context, and build the context for us. Generation complete. Let's go ahead and select OK. And you can see it's pretty much straight through your steps. However, there's no decisions. There's no, what if something happens? What if, for example, the order request object is invalid at step 2? What if this is invalid? What if it's valid? Where does it go within this flow? So what we're going to do is we're going to go to step 2, and we are going to throw an exception. So we mouse over where it says add exception path. We select it. We name the exception path. We're going to call this order request object invalid, right? And the type is exception. We're going to go ahead and hit OK. And if we go back to your entry points, we now have an exception created. Let's go ahead and double click on it. And let's put in a flow here on this invalid request. And we may start with something like invalid response received, right? That's going to be, well, where is that coming from? And that's going to be from the order processing. So this is going to lead into order request fallout. So it's going to fall out of the system and be processed, all right? So order request, did I spell that right? It's red. Let's change this to system from actor, and that should be highlighted. Let's go to context. I don't have an order request in here. I have order request. There's a space in there for that activity that's a control flow from start, but I don't have an order request. So now what you can do is you can come back into context and you can add a new item and then find in your types order request. So we're going to go into our catalogs and we are going to see if we can find an order request data object. Let's look in service function, order request, and here's an input set. We're going to use this. So then once we add it in here, we're going to right click, we're going to refresh, and there we go. It is now linked in context for this scenario, right? And then what we can do is we can come back to endpoints and we can select the top, which is the basic path. And for this order request invalid, where is this going to go if it is invalid? Well, the answer is it's going to go to the final step, order processing, and it's going to go to the Kafka message bus. So let's expand this, make sure that we've got, this is bus, message bus. So very fast to see, catch errors, and you'll catch them when you go to auto-generate the diagram. But this invalid request is going to step 5. We get a drop down. Because we have 5 steps, we have 5 steps to choose from, and we're going to have this lead to step 5. But are there any other exceptions or alternate paths? Well, what if the order is valid, right? We want to basically go from here to here, but how are we getting there? Are we just going directly to it? If it's invalid, we're just going right to valid. Well, let's test that by adding in an exception or an alternate path and see how that flows from there. But before we do that, let's regenerate our activity diagram. So we're going to leave it up. It's sitting right here. We're going to leave it up and we're going to come back to the drop down here for choosing an auto-generated diagram, right? We're going to select activity. Now you get a pop that says, hey, do you want to overwrite the existing or do you want to synchronize elements with existing? Well, we're just going to override. We don't care. However, you're making manual changes into that diagram. You don't want to mess that up. So you would use this option here. All right. And then you can preserve the diagram layout if you need to. And if you're making changes to the diagram layout, you probably want to preserve that. But let's just overwrite for now. And we're going to go ahead and select processing. And it's processing and should generate soon. And it is complete. We're going to select OK. And now let's just zoom out. We don't need to care too much about this. We zoom out. You can see that an exception was thrown. It goes through these particular events, these steps, if you will, that we logged. And then it goes to what we said was step 5 before it ends. So it's going to go to the bus architecture, send a message event pertaining to the order was invalid, and it's going to fall out for back office processing, or whatever your strategy is. All right. So we're going to add in another exception now. What if it's valid? We can use exception or we can use alternate path. And I'm going to choose exception because when I'm doing the processing, I'm going to be throwing an exception within my code, and then it's going to go either direction based on how I code the throw and the catch from the exception handling that's taking place. So we complete the steps within this exception for valid, and then we go back to the basic path right here, which we've called order processing start event. And we want, when it's valid, we want it to go to step 3, order processing valid. So we're going to throw this to step 3. And now what we're going to do is regenerate our activity diagram to get an update. So we're going to overwrite the existing diagram. We're going to select OK, and it's going to start generating that diagram for us. All right, generation complete. We're going to select OK. Just anywhere in here, roll our mouse button and zoom out. So you can see now that at the exception, we have 2 paths to take based on the outcomes and whether it's invalid or valid. You can see if it's valid, it goes to step 3, which is order processing valid. And then it goes through to complete. So we can come down here and execute manual simulation. It'll step through, hit the decision point, ask us some questions. We're going to say the order is valid, select OK. You can see it stepping through, and then eventually it'll get to an end process. Now, the interesting thing is here is that it immediately from the start event runs into our choreography diagram. I'm going to go ahead and cancel it. We're not going to run it, but that's the exciting thing about auto-generating various UML diagrams while you're working on your structured editor and scenarios. The other thing is you can create sequence diagrams from your structured editor, including your exception handling. Let's go ahead and run a sequence diagram. And it's auto-generating a sequence diagram based off of the steps that we laid out in the structured editor. So I'm going to move this over so we can see this. You can see it is receiving from the Kafka bus for order processing is valid. It runs validation process, and then it processes it through the order request, choreography element, and it also posts back the results to the bus architecture during processing. And so you can certainly build a lot more into this, more definitions, use real code within your references within your sequence diagrams, and much more than that. All right. To quickly find your diagrams that you've auto-generated, select the element, hit Alt and the G key, finds the element within your browser. You'll see that there's a caret to expand. You can go down. Here's your auto-generated activity diagram, and here is your auto-generated sequence diagram. So your basic path, your invalid sequence, your valid sequence, auto-generated for you. And you can certainly tailor these more, regenerate them as you're going forward, explaining or validating your architecture, as well as developing more requirements. As I've stated, any element allows you to develop requirements on the element, ask questions, make assumptions, and even build scenarios from any element that you want at any time. Another thing that you can do is auto-generate test cases. So we're gonna generate just an internal test case, very simple. It goes through, builds the test case for you on the start element. Here's your test plan package, your basic path, your exceptions, and everything for your testing team. Thank you for watching this extra as part of the BPMN series. Let me know if you got any questions or concerns. Until then, happy modeling.